Hi students, my name is John McCollum and I'm a graduate student here in the sociology program at University of California, Irvine. And today I'm going to introduce a new concept to you. And this idea is called the nation-state. So the nation-state is one of the main building blocks for talking about international relations and globalization. And so before we can begin really talking about those kinds of things, we have to really break down our terms and understand what they mean. So the two basic building blocks for nation-states are nations and states. So we'll talk about what those mean and how we apply them. So first I want to talk about states. Now, when I ask you what state you live in, you probably want to say California. But when we're talking about international relations and globalization, we mean a little bit different things when we talk about states. Not every country in the world is organized into states, like the United States. So when we talk about states, what we really mean is country. So you can see this definition on the slide. A state is an organized community living under a single government which has exclusive control over its own territory. So when you look at the map and you typically think about countries, for the purposes of what we're doing in this class, you think about them as states. And it's okay throughout my presentation if instead of the word state, you want to go ahead and read country. So one of the unique things about states is that they're responsible for their citizens' welfare. So what I really mean by welfare isn't a monthly check you get from the government. What I mean is the well-being of citizens. So some of these things might include health, security, maybe against foreign or domestic enemies, and then some form of opportunity, economic or educational. So again, we're talking about nation states, so we've got our first definition for what states are, but now we got to define nations. So a state, when we talk about states, it's largely political, our definition. But for nations, what we really mean is something that's cultural. So you can see here a few things that I've listed of some of the cultural characteristics of nations. Some of them might include language, customs, religion, ancestry, or origins and histories. Not all nations, though, have a state that they belong to. And so I'm going to walk you through a little example about the Kurdish nation. So here you can see there's a map of the traditional area that the Kurds inhabit, and this would include eastern Turkey, eastern Syria, northern Iraq, and western Iran. The Kurds are a minority ethnic group living in that area, and they share some of the common cultural characteristics that we expect of nations. They have a common language, which is Kurdish. They have distinct customs, which distinguish them from their neighbors, and they have a distinct history. However, as you can see from the map, the Kurds are split between several different states or countries, and this makes them a nation without a state. And maybe you can think of a few examples of your own. Okay, so now we know what states are and we define what nations are. So let's put the term together. So a nation state is a political state that encompasses an entire nation. And typically this idea is that for every state there'll be a single nation living in it, a single cultural group of people. So people who live in these nation states, they're citizens and their rights are protected by the state. Of course, in our nation state, the United States, these rights can be found in the Bill of Rights at the beginning of the U.S. Constitution. So now that we know what nation states are, to go forward in the course, we have to think about where do they come from. So nation states, the idea of nation states begins in Europe between the years 1450 and 1650. So before this period where you really begin to see nation states, most of the world was a mix of different kinds of empires and feudal territories. A feudal territory is a place ruled by a king or a noble. And a lot of these areas tend to have many different ethnic groups. An example of this might be the Spanish Empire. So the Spanish had their lands in Spain, where most people who were there were Spanish, but they also had territories in the New World, in North and South America, and that was a very diverse place. Also during this time, and this is really important for what I'm going to talk about next, the borders were very undefined between these empires. So when you looked at a map at the time, you didn't see nice clean lines like you would on a world map today. And because these borders tended to be undefined, people fought a lot about where they really lied. So warfare was nearly constant between large empires, as empires battled over these undefined areas at their edges. And one example of this, I'll get into more later about why this is important, is the 30 Years' War that was largely located in what is today Germany. Also, people living in these areas weren't citizens. So the idea that the state protected your rights, protected your right to things like free speech or freedom of religion, that idea just didn't exist. Also, the idea of nations, a cultural group that people belong to, was still many decades away. Instead of being loyal to a state or a nation, in the kind of sense we might think about patriotism, that didn't really exist. So most people's personal loyalty, their personal allegiance, was to a local lord or to the king himself. So during this time, between 1450 and 1650, a lot of unique things are really happening in the world. For the first time, Europeans are really beginning to explore the world and expand their empires. So I'm sure you know, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So as Europeans spread all over the world, they needed bigger armies and navies. Naturally, states weren't really happy when other states tried to colonize areas they claimed. And also in Europe itself, people were fighting a lot. So these wars were taking place over larger areas. You needed larger armies. After all, you didn't want to be the state with the smallest army. And then the weapons employed happened to be gunpowder weapons, and they were much more expensive and required professional soldiers to use them. So these growing nation states, they needed more taxes to keep these permanent armies, these large navies. And so when they needed more taxes, they had to come up with a more modern-looking state. So during this period, in order to get more taxes and to get them on a yearly basis, states started to look more modern. Now what I mean by that is if you look at the US government today, you'll notice that there are very unique branches of government. As maybe you've studied, we have 3 branches of government in the United States: executive, legislative, and judicial. And these branches do unique things. Prior to this, states mostly appointed nobles to do important tasks. So they really needed professionals at this time to do these really important things. So it used to be, prior to this period, that the king made every decision in the country. But with specialized tasks, you needed more authority spread over in more places. So we say the state became independent of the king. And sometimes the queen. There were a few important queens during this period, but most leaders tended to be men. And then, as taxes began to be more and more collected, people wanted more say in how they were spent. So in some of these growing nation states, they even became republics or democracies. And I put a little asterisk here in the presentation because these democracies and republics weren't what we think of today. Most tended to be led by the wealthiest men, the wealthiest merchants of a state. And there was also one more important result of all these wars. People began to take on the kinds of cultural characteristics we think of as nations. These types of wars made people see that they had a common interest in their own security, they had common histories, and all this gathering of people for these wars also made people speak more common languages. So if we had to, let's say, give a birthday to the nation-state system, we could trace it to one treaty in particular. That's called the Treaty of Westphalia. Some people say Westphalia. And this ended the 30 Years' War. And as you can imagine, this was a very destructive war, and it lasted a very long time. So this war created what we know today as the nation-state system, and we'll talk more about that system and how it works in a second. So the root cause of this war, and this is important in a little bit, is that Protestant and Catholic kings fought over one another's religious choices. So states tended to be always fighting and trying to interfere within one another's internal problems. And then, of course, like we discussed earlier, a lot of these empires, their borders weren't defined. So deciding whose authority existed where was very difficult, led to a lot of fighting. So this treaty, it ends this war, that's great. But there became 2 major ideas that come out of it that are still with us today, about 350 years later. And these 2 ideas, and they're very important, are sovereignty and citizenship. And we'll talk about those in a second. But other things that came out of this treaty too that are equally as important is that state borders became rigidly defined. So to prevent the kinds of warfare that had been going on for 30 years, it was important to establish who had what authority where. And defining borders was one way to do that. Also, states became the main unit for international diplomacy. Now this may be a new word for you. Diplomacy basically means negotiation between states. So prior to this period, let's say 2 kings wanted to make a peace treaty. Well, what they would do is negotiate it as individuals. But after this, it became the state that was the main unit. And by the way, some of you I know are in Model UN. When you do Model UN, you're doing international diplomacy. So what is sovereignty? So sovereignty is the quality of having independent authority over a geographic territory and the population of that territory. So when a state is sovereign, it's the only political authority over an area. And naturally, when there's one authority, kind of limits conflict. Otherwise, you'd have two or more parties fighting over who had control. So what this was meant to do is that it limited conflict between states over borders, and especially control at the edges of their states. So what this led to, states promised that they'd recognize one another's authority over their own people and territory. So not only were states sovereign over just the area that they had control, they were also sovereign over the people who lived there. Of course, we can look at the world today and some of the ongoing conflicts there and know that this hasn't always worked out. So one of the unique things about sovereignty is that it comes from other states. You can't be self-sovereign. Other states have to declare that you're sovereign. So this can be highly political. States might grant or deny recognition of sovereignty for their own goals. So one example in the world today that's very important is Taiwan's sovereignty. So different states have very different relationships with Taiwan. Mainland China, the People's Republic of China, claims that Taiwan is its sovereign territory. The U.S. chooses not to recognize Taiwan as sovereign, but yet tries to carry on normal relations with Taiwan. So I'll give you a second here to debate, why might states do this? Why might states grant or deny sovereignty? Okay, so now we've discussed sovereignty, let's discuss the other main idea of the Treaty of Westphalia. So this idea is known as citizenship, and I'm sure it's a term you're familiar with. So in the original treaty, states claimed responsibility for their citizens. So what this really meant in the original, and we've elaborated on that idea in 350 years, is that states said that they would take responsibility for their citizens when they were abroad. So basically during this period where you had so much unrest, citizens from one state often would agitate in another state for things like, I don't know, changing the religious or political order. So what this laid the groundwork for is that states should also protect their citizens from other states. So naturally this hasn't always worked out, right? Many conflicts in the world, we can see that states aren't capable or willing to take care of their own citizens. So who enforces these rules of sovereignty and citizenship? So the easy answer is that states themselves. So one of the ways they might do this is through international law. So when states sign two treaties, in effect, they're making law between their two countries. Sometimes they establish permanent bodies, and we call these international governmental organizations, or IGOs for short. And these are permanent standing bodies that help to ensure that the laws of sovereignty and citizenship are followed. So sometimes states are more capable of protecting their sovereignty than others. The United States, for instance, is a very strong state. So how does the United States, or why, is it more capable of protecting its sovereignty than other states? What's unique, though, is that even though states are the main protectors of sovereignty and citizenship, they also tend to be the main violators. So powerful states might use political power and economic power to pressure other states into doing what they want, rather than what might be in that other state's best interest. So there are, however, some unique situations where it is acceptable for a state to violate another state's sovereignty. Maybe you can think of a few examples of your own. So now this system, it's about 350 years old at this point, and we want to take a long view of those 350 years and think about, has Westphalia been a success? And I think a lot of scholars would say yes. So by defining borders between states, we've limited a lot of conflict over those same borders. Also, by limiting state interventions in one another's affairs, this tends to hold down conflict in some ways. And then lastly, we're all the benefits of this system because our states are now taking care of us. We have access to things like education and healthcare that maybe we wouldn't if we didn't have this idea of citizenship. So what's also unique about this time period is that the number of states in the world has really risen and fallen with the preceding centuries. So after World War II, large areas of Latin America, Africa, and Asia have been decolonized or made independent from European control. So that's also how the nation-state system has spread throughout the world. As these states decolonized and became independent, they also adapted much of the rules of the Westphalian system to their own political situations. Today, there are about 195 recognized states in the world, and that's a considerably higher number than there were at the original number of states during the Westphalian Treaty. However, because this number of states relies on recognition, different states will have different counts. Some states may even count as many as over 200, and some as few as less than 190. However, this system is changing a lot. You've probably heard this term a lot in the news. We're living in a globalized world. So there's a lot of new political and economic arrangements between states. So four main areas of emphasis that I'm going to go into here briefly are multinational corporations, intergovernmental organizations, regional power blocs, and non-state political actors. And we'll talk more about what each of those means and why they're important for the nation-state system. The first we have to contend with are multinational corporations, or MNCs. So a brief definition is that MNCs are large businesses. They tend to be registered as a legal entity in one state, but they have operations in more than one state. What's unique about them is that they're said to have no allegiance to a state, meaning that they move freely between states looking for the best business opportunities. So thanks to advances in technology, investment dollars and business operations can be quickly moved around the world. And in some ways, this is actually the main definition of globalization, the ability to move people, money, ideas faster than ever. So multinational corporations, they are businesses and they want to make money. So what they do is they move to the places they can make the most profits. But sometimes, this isn't for the benefit of everyone. So poor people living in poorer countries are often the most vulnerable citizens of those areas. And these countries are often really great places for low-wage labor or low environmental standards. And it's the poor in those states who really bear the highest burden from these types of operations. Sometimes states might listen more to the multinational corporations than to their own citizens. And this can make it really difficult for states to provide for their citizens' welfare. So one of the other challenges for globalization is a new form of governance. Sometimes we call them international governmental organizations, but intergovernmental organizations will work as well. So what these are public or government organizations created by either treaty or agreement between two or more states. So IGOs, what they exist to do is to coordinate political and economic goals. So there's many different ways that they might do this. And of course, some of these agreements will vary greatly in size. So I'll give you a challenge to find out how many states are involved in the three following organizations: the United Nations, which you're all participating in Model UN, the International Criminal Court, and lastly, the World Trade Organizations. I also challenge you to find out what each of these organizations does. So what do IGOs do specifically? So most of them act as forums where countries can air their grievances or talk about plans of action. So coordinating action, discussing issues, and some are even there for gathering information. They are great for small states because they give them a forum to express their concerns that they wouldn't normally have. However, there are some issues with IGOs. Sometimes they interfere with state sovereignty. An IGO collectively may decide on a policy that's to the detriment of some of its members. So large states can sometimes use them to obstruct the goals of weaker states. So what are some sovereignty issues with IGOs you can think of? And maybe use your own experiences with Model UN as an example. So another unique arrangement are regional power blocs. They're a bit different from IGOs for a few reasons. So what they are is that they actually are common national groups encompassing multiple states. So some examples might be the European Union, or EU for short, the African Union, or the Arab League. So in what ways might these be similar or different from the usual idea of the nation-state? So last thing I'm going to talk about are non-state political actors. So in a globalized world where we're so capable of moving money, ideas, or even entire worldviews between groups, it creates new opportunities for different groups to try to influence the state outside the usual government channels. So this is a very wide selection of groups, and they have very different interests. But two that are really important in today's world might be terrorist groups who don't have a state that they belong to, or non-governmental organizations. So there's many different positives associated with all kinds of non-state political actors. Lots of times they give a voice for average citizens to express their grievances or try to coordinate action. Sometimes they allow for different social movements that are pushing for different types of reforms to coordinate their actions between states. There's a lot of globalized problems requiring a global solution. And so these non-state political actors give a forum for NGOs to act together. And then lastly, they advance agendas for what I think we would all agree are positive things, like human rights or the environment, any number of positive outcomes these groups are pressuring for. However, there are some associated negatives, and it depends largely on the group. So some of these groups undermine the legitimacy of the state. Why do you need a state when a non-state political actor can provide the same things for you that the state does? And you can see where these authorities overlap that it might create conflict. As non-state actors, being outside the state, sometimes it's difficult for states to control these groups, and terrorist groups are one example. Also, with the same example of terrorism, some states can actually be punished by other states for the activities of non-state groups that they don't have any control over. And maybe we could look at the Middle East today and the US war on terror as an example. So again, we're living in a changing, globalized world. So nation-states have got to adapt to a different world. So some scholars are saying that states are actually losing their importance to all the before-mentioned groups. But we live in a state of our own, and we can see that this state has a lot of control over different areas of our lives. So clearly they are important in some ways. And most scholars say today that the idea is just changing. Nation-state isn't going away. So when we think about the future of the nation-state system, we have to think, what will the globe look like in 20 years? In my own lifetime, and I'm 25, I've seen the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of new states in Africa, and the beginning of NAFTA here in the United States, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has really shaped this continent in a really unique way. So then we think, well, what will happen in 50 years? And then lastly, what about the future of conflict? Will the nation-state system be more or less stable? And one of the unique things in this world, maybe regional power blocks will actually take off as the new states. And that's all I've got for you today. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.